So there's almost always that one person that you connect to most in your childhood. You know, all buddy-buddy and best of friends, inseparable. Well, I never really had that. I had all the books. And of course, the books I connected to most were the ones that my teachers would read me. Cinderella, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, the fairy tales, and the happy endings. I would also, of course, always go home and try to find them on my bookshelf. And I'd end up sitting on a chair, just looking at all the amazing pictures, seeing as I couldn't read very well at that time. There was one book, though, that I remember connecting to. Hansel and Gretel. One day, a woodcutter was out in the forest chopping his wood, chop, 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 just like any other ordinary day. And his two children, Hansel and Gretel, were walking along in the woods. Meanwhile, Hansel had brought a loaf of bread and was sprinkling breadcrumbs along the trail as they went so they could find their way home. What the two of them didn't know was that a bird was following behind them, and the bird was eating every little breadcrumb that they threw on the trail. Eventually, the sky started to grow dark, and the sun started to set, and the two children decided it was time to turn around and head home. As soon as they turned around, they noticed there were no breadcrumbs. So, they were kind of scared at first, but decided that they should still walk home. Of course, this made them even more lost than they already were. Eventually, though, with good luck, they stumbled upon a house. Now, let me tell you, this was no ordinary house. This was a gingerbread house, and it was littered with every kind of candy you could ever imagine. There were licorice gutters, and it was outlined in jelly beans. The patio was graham cracker, the doorknob was a gumdrop, and there was even a nice thin coat of snow made out of icing. Now the children, seeing as they hadn't eaten all day, decided that they would go up and try some of the candy. As soon as they started eating, they just couldn't stop. But soon, they heard a thump, thump, thump of footsteps coming from inside the house, followed by yelling. "Who could ever be so rude as to eat some of my house? I am about to go and have a very good talking to them." As soon as the door opened, the yelling stopped, and the children froze, for they noticed that the person yelling at them in the house, the owner of the house, was a witch. Now, the witch, wanting to be kind and considerate, invited them in for dinner. "Oh, you poor little children! Would you like to come in for a dinner? I have a beautiful turkey, and I just finished cooking some cookies." The children, not wanting to be rude, accepted the offer and cautiously walked into the house. Now, as soon as they entered, there was this amazing whiff of cookies, and there was a crackling fire with a nice kettle of tea on top. But before they could approach the dinner table, the witch had snatched them up and tucked them in a hidden room and started to lock them up in cages. They started to scream and scream and scream, "Ah!" But seeing as they were so far from any village, the only person who heard them was the witch, and all she did was cackle and continue to lock them up. So as soon as the kids were all locked up, Hansel noticed something. There was a huge plate of meat in his cage, but poor Gretel, all she got was a tiny sliver of toast. So Hansel ate like he'd never eaten before in his life, and Gretel savored every tiny little piece of toast, every tiny bite. This went on for a couple of weeks, and Gretel was always met at every meal with some toast. Meanwhile, Hansel was met with a ton of meat, and cookies and candy. Of course, Hansel started to grow rather big, and eventually the witch decided to carry on with her plan. Now her plan was to cook Hansel after he had gotten large and invite a bunch of friends over to share in her feast. So, that morning, she unlocked Hansel's cage and took him outside to eat candy off of her house as much as he could. As soon as the door closed, though, Gretel decided that she would try to reach the keys, but they were just out of her reach. And so she started to pick up a bone off the ground from one of her brother's meals. And as soon as that happened, she heard a piercing cry. "Gretel! Gretel! Gretel! Help! Gretel! Greta? Greta? Greta, sweetie? Huh? Wake up. It's the first day of summer vacation."